World War I is remembered for the mud-soaked trenches, the deafening roar of artillery, and the staggering human cost. But the true battle was fought far from the front lines in banks, ledgers, and the hidden corridors of power where money dictated the war's rhythm. Governments borrowed endlessly, citizens invested their life savings in patriotic bonds, and financial empires moved in ways that determined who would survive and who would suffer. Entire nations wagered their futures on decisions few fully understood, and ordinary people were drawn into a massive experiment of debt, speculation, and unseen risk. As the war raged, fortunes rose and fell, currencies destabilized, and economic systems were stretched to their breaking point, and the choices made here would echo for decades, shaping economies and lives in ways few could anticipate. Keep watching, because the mistakes, bubbles, and hidden strategies that follow will reveal the true cost of mismanaged wealth. The financial foundations of the pre-war world were deceptively fragile. The gold standard, once thought unshakable, began to falter almost immediately as nations poured money into the war effort. Gold reserves, which had long underpinned confidence in currency and trade, were depleted at unprecedented rates. Banks struggled to maintain liquidity while governments issued bonds faster than any economy had ever experienced. Citizens, convinced of their duty and the stability of their nation, purchased these bonds enthusiastically, unknowingly feeding a financial system stretched to its breaking point. Every loan, every issuance of currency, shifted risk from governments to ordinary people, creating layers of vulnerability few could see at the same time. Speculative bubbles emerged in industry and raw materials. Companies producing weapons, munitions, and supplies flourished, their stock values soaring in the frenzy of war demand. Investors poured money into firms they believed would never fail, often ignoring warning signs or the broader context. And yet, as history would later show, these bubbles were illusions. Fortunes that appeared secure were built entirely on borrowed confidence, dependent on a war that could end at any moment. Those who failed to recognize the fragility of these systems would see their savings vanish almost overnight. The intertwining of government debt and private speculation created a tension that mirrors the financial world even today. Every decision to print more money, to raise another loan, or to inflate bond values introduced new vulnerabilities. Nations believed themselves unsinkable, just as markets and investors often do, and the consequences of overconfidence would ripple across decades. It is a lesson that becomes hard to ignore once you see how one misstep in financial judgment could trigger cascading failures in multiple economies, and the next examples we'll explore reveal exactly how far-reaching these consequences were, the kind of miscalculations that reshaped the wealth of entire nations. As governments scrambled to fund the conflict, some of the most consequential mistakes were hidden in plain sight. Nations overestimated their capacity to sustain long-term borrowing, assuming victory would come before debt became unmanageable. The British Empire, for example, leaned heavily on loans from the United States, creating a dependency that shifted global economic power. Meanwhile, Germany attempted to fund its war effort through domestic borrowing, printing money at unprecedented rates. At first, these decisions appeared effective. Armies were supplied, industries expanded, and national morale remained high. But beneath this surface, the seeds of inflation, currency instability, and long-term economic strain were already planted. Ordinary citizens, convinced their investments were patriotic and safe, were unknowingly footing a bill they would only realize decades later. Speculation thrived alongside these government missteps. Industries producing armaments, textiles, and raw materials saw share prices soar, often divorced from actual productivity or long-term demand. Investors believed that as long as the war continued, profits would flow and bubbles could not burst. Yet every surge of confidence concealed a deeper fragility. When the war ended, these inflated valuations would collapse almost instantly, leaving fortunes decimated. This cycle of blind trust, reckless borrowing, and temporary windfalls is strikingly familiar, echoing patterns that would repeat in the 1920s and even in modern financial markets. Understanding this moment in history is crucial because it shows how easily perceived stability can be an illusion, and how deeply ordinary people can be affected by decisions made far above their control. One particularly striking example lies in the management of war bonds. Governments marketed them not merely as financial instruments but as moral obligations, entwining patriotism with personal savings. Citizens invested, believing they were securing the nation's future, while the real impact was a massive transfer of financial risk from states to individuals. Many families would see their savings eroded by inflation, delayed repayments, and post-war economic adjustments, while financiers and banks navigated the turmoil with relative insulation. These hidden shifts of wealth remind us that in every major conflict, the battle is not only fought with armies and weapons, but also with trust, perception, and the delicate balance of economic power. The financial mistakes made during the war did not vanish with the armistice. They rippled through economies for years, reshaping wealth, industry, and international influence. Nations faced staggering debt, with interest obligations consuming a significant portion of post-war budgets. Germany, burdened by reparations and domestic inflation, saw the value of its currency plummet, sending everyday citizens into financial desperation while a handful of industrialists and speculators adapted to the chaos. Britain and France, though victorious, were similarly encumbered by debts to the United States, altering the balance of global financial power and setting the stage for decades of economic tension. The ordinary people who had purchased war bonds were left to navigate a world where the returns they expected were diminished or delayed, their savings eroded by inflation and unstable markets. Industrial sectors that had boomed during the war faced collapse as demand dropped suddenly. Factories that produced munitions, textiles, and raw materials were overbuilt, overstaffed, and heavily leveraged. Investors who had poured money into these industries discovered that post-war reality rarely matched wartime projections. Economies that had appeared unstoppable during the conflict now teetered, forcing governments to intervene and sometimes nationalize essential industries to prevent total collapse. These decisions, while necessary for survival, altered the distribution of wealth and influence, showing how financial errors made in wartime can cascade. Far beyond the battlefield, the war also left a legacy of systemic vulnerability. The collapse of the gold standard, combined with unprecedented government borrowing, demonstrated the limits of financial systems once considered stable. Ordinary citizens, speculators, and nations alike were caught in the delicate interplay of debt, currency valuation, and confidence. Misjudgments during this period seeded inflation, destabilized economies, and created conditions that would contribute to the Great Depression and global financial crises decades later. The lesson is clear: even the most powerful economies are subject to the invisible pressures of debt, trust, and overconfidence, and a miscalculation in one corner of the world can echo across continents. By examining the financial battles behind the war, it becomes evident that wealth and power offered no immunity. Governments, banks, and investors faced consequences proportionate to their exposure, and ordinary citizens bore the hidden cost of strategic missteps. The decisions made in these years reveal not only the fragility of economies under strain but also the human cost of financial overreach and hubris. The aftermath of World War I revealed that no financial system, no matter how sophisticated, is immune to the pressures of war, debt, and human error. Nations that had seemed unshakable were forced to confront the limits of their wealth, the fragility of trust, and the consequences of decisions made in the fog of crisis. Families who had invested in patriotic bonds discovered that loyalty and sacrifice did not guarantee security. Entire industries that had flourished under wartime demand faced collapse, their rapid expansion undone by the sudden return to peace. Banks and financiers who had navigated the chaos found themselves contending with volatile markets and the burden of a world reshaped by debt and inflation. Yet within this devastation, patterns emerge that tell a story about the enduring dynamics of money, power, and risk. The financial battles of World War I were as consequential as the battles fought in the trenches, and they left a legacy that influenced economic policy, investment strategies, and the management of national debt for decades. They remind us that wealth is not merely an accumulation of assets but a measure of resilience, judgment, and foresight. Decisions made in times of crisis resonate far beyond their moment, shaping futures in ways that cannot be predicted or controlled. History shows that financial systems are living structures, vulnerable to miscalculation, overconfidence, and the unseen pressures that build in times of upheaval. The First World War did not just redraw political boundaries or end empires. It exposed the hidden fragility of economies, the human cost of mismanaged wealth, and the profound consequences of financial overreach. It serves as a reminder that no matter how vast a fortune or how entrenched a system, it is always subject to forces beyond immediate control. And when those forces collide, the outcomes are irreversible, leaving lessons etched into the ledger of history for all who choose to observe.